Hello, I'm Dr. Winston Yort. I'm a software engineer, but I also am very interested in elections and voting systems. My province of British Columbia is having a referendum on whether or not to adopt proportional representation in the place of first-past-the-post for our voting system. I've made this series of videos in order to help voters, particularly conservative voters like myself, make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. I've covered a lot of ground in these videos, and that's because this is a complex subject. In this video, I'm going to try and hit upon some of the big picture items that I think are really important for making a decision about how you're going to vote in this referendum. One of the biggest issues to understand is that we already have coalitions today. A lot of the arguments you're going to hear against proportional representation really come down to saying it's going to be bad because we're going to be ruled by coalition governments. But all political parties are coalitions, and so we're already ruled by coalition governments. It's just a matter that today, these coalitions form before the election, and under proportional representation, these coalitions would form after the election. Critically, the coalition process that happens in first-past-the-post happens behind closed doors within party structures to the degree that we're not even aware of it. Under proportional representation, we're aware of the coalition negotiation process, and we're aware of all of these factors that come to play in a coalition that are hidden behind the scenes at first-past-the-post. Effectively, proportional representation makes the coalition process more transparent. Both the opponents and proponents of proportional representation have an exaggerated idea of how much difference there's actually going to be under proportional representation. The fact is, the situation is not actually going to be that dramatically different from today, for better or for worse. We're still going to be governed by a coalition which is a compromise between many political factions that probably makes nobody particularly happy. Politicians will do everything we despise politicians for: breaking promises, buying votes, getting into scandals. Fundamentally, all these problems we have are inherent with democracy. And proportional representation doesn't solve them, but it also doesn't introduce them. These are just what happens when you've got a democracy with many different groups of people vying for control. But having said that, what is better, proportional representation or first-past-the-post? Well, let me try to boil it down into what I think the big picture items are. Under first-past-the-post, you have very little control over your representatives. You can vote, you can participate in the nomination process for a political party, but at the end of the day, you don't have much control over who is your representative. Under proportional representation, you choose the party that represents you. Your vote primarily goes to increase the number of votes a party gets, and therefore their number of seats. And so your primary form of representation in proportional representation is that party, and you have a free choice as to which party it is. A consequence of this is strategic voting. It's very common in first-past-the-post to vote for someone other than your preferred candidate because you don't want to split the vote. And this is because you don't actually have control of your representative, you're simply casting a vote. This isn't the case under proportional representation because you actually control your representative, you just choose them. And there's no need to be strategic about it. You don't need to be concerned about what vote splits are going on, you just vote for the party that is your favorite. First-past-the-post creates a government that is largely unencumbered. It can do what it likes. It can even implement unpopular policies if it deems it necessary. Under proportional representation, this is not so much the case because the government has to always keep its coalition partners happy. It's always being held account by these various other parties that are members of its coalition. And as such, it doesn't have the same unchecked power, and it's much more difficult for it to do things that are unpopular, or essentially things that actually are not supported by the legislature of representatives of the population. As such, governments can't make broad sweeping changes under proportional representation and are instead restricted to making rather incremental and small changes. On first-past-the-post, you're actually passing judgment on the government. You're deciding whether or not to give the government of the day another run at government, or if you want to replace them and put the opposition in charge. Under proportional representation, you aren't actually passing judgment on the government. You actually aren't having a direct say on the government at all. What you're doing instead is you're saying, I want to choose the party who's going to represent my interests during that negotiation process. And as such, you're really evaluating not the government, but how well did your party do in representing your interests. Those are the big issues you need to think about to determine whether or not you prefer proportional representation or first-past-the-post in principle. However, you also have to think about how this current process is being pursued and how the NDP basically seem to be trying to rush through a change to the electoral system in time for the next election, rather than taking the time to do it right. Here's the thing. If you really believed in the logic of proportional representation, the last thing you would do is have politicians elected by first past the post designing a proportional election system. Now, ideally, you make up your own mind about whether or not you support proportional representation in this referendum. But I find a certain number of people actually just want to know how I'm going to vote. And the answer to that question is, I plan to support proportional representation. I do have some extreme concerns about the way it's being pursued, and there's a part of me that thinks, in principle, I shouldn't support it because I shouldn't support something being rushed through this, and I certainly shouldn't support first past the post elected politicians designing a proportional system. On balance, however, I think that it's very difficult to rig a proportional system, and as such, I'm going to go ahead and support it. As for the system to support, I'm currently undecided between mixed member proportional and dual member proportional. On the side of mixed member proportional is the fact that it is used in a number of other places, so it's tried and tested, and it's simple. It's simpler than the other systems being considered. On the other hand, dual member proportional is more detailed at this point. We have a better idea of what we'll get if we implement dual member proportional than mixed member proportional. And furthermore, dual member proportional requires that everyone who actually wins a seat actually has to have run in the riding for that seat. So no one gets elected simply by being on a party list, which seems like a useful property. As it is, I see pros and cons to both of those options, and I'm currently undecided which one I'm going to be marking on my ballot. I hope I've given you the information you need in order to make an informed decision about proportional representation and this referendum. Please take the time to mail in your ballot and vote. This is a particular concern now because mail-in ballots often are not returned and have very low turnout, which might mean that your decision actually to vote matters much more now than in a regular election, as many other people won't be turning in their ballot. So please take the opportunity to exercise your democratic right and cast a ballot in this important referendum.